of the United Pontian Brotherhood of New South Wales, Bondoxeniteas, I welcome you all to the annual Pontian Genocide commemoration. It is being held here in the Parliament of New South Wales in Sydney for the first time, and we thank our host, the Honourable Sophie Kotsis, Member of the Legislative Council, Shadow Minister for Local Government, Industrial Relations and for the Status of Women, for this opportunity to be here. Please be patient as I acknowledge our distinguished guests who have not only joined us this evening, but also support our cause. I apologise in advance for any names that I may have inadvertently missed, but I will do my best to make sure that everyone has been acknowledged. His Excellency Consul General of Greece, Mr. Vasilios Tolios, and his wife, Mrs. Dora Toumanidou Tolios. Father Nicholas. The Honourable Michael Atkinson, former Attorney General, Member for Croydon, South Australia. Professor Colin Tatz and his wife, Mrs. Sandra Tatz. Miss Sophie Kotsis, the Honourable David Clark, Parliamentary Secretary for Justice, the Honourable Walt Secord, Labor Member of the Legislative Council, Mr. David Shoebridge, Member of the Legislative Council for the Green Party, Mr. Robert Ferrolo, Member of Parliament for Lakemba and Shadow Minister for Roads, the Honourable Gladys Berejiklian, Member of Parliament for Willoughby and Minister for Transport, the Honourable Reverend Fred Knoll, the Christian Democratic Party, and we especially thank him for his attendance this evening. Mr. Dimitrios Kouklidis, President of the United Pontian Benevolent Brotherhood Bondoxeniteas, Mr. Virant Megadician, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of Australia, Mr. Hermes Shahen, Secretary of Assyrian Universal Alliance, Australian Chapter, and his committee, Mr. Vic Akhladev, Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, Mr. Nick Chrysostomidis, President of the Federation of Australian Pontian Associations, Mr. Peter Papoulidis, Secretary of the Federation of Australian Pontian Associations. We are extremely honoured to have with us tonight the Board of the Australian Institute of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Professor Winton Higgins, President, Professor Colin Tatz, Vice President, Mehi Gregorian, Panayotis Diamandis, also Dr. Avril Alba, Lecturer in Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney. We would also like to thank our local government councillors, representatives, and our local community representatives. Mr. Onufrios Gorazidis, Pontic Foundation, Panagia Soumela, Victoria. Mr. Harry Danalis, President, Greek Orthodox Community of New South Wales. Mr. Michael Christodoulou, President, Cyprus Community of New South Wales. Mr. Panayotis Diamandis, Australian Hellenic Council. Councillor Angelo Anestis, Councillor Bill Saravinovsky, and Councillor Shane O'Brien from Rockdale Council. Councillor Angelo Tsirikis, Canada Bay Council. Councillor Bill Katharis, Canterbury Council, Councillor John Prokopiadis, Randwick Council, Mr. Steve Camper, Mr. John Theodoridis, President Grand Lodge AHEPA and President of Pontian Association Panagia Soumela, Mrs. Litsa Diakovasili, District President AHEPA, Mr. Kon Efthimiadis and Mr. Chris Glazidis, Pontian Association Panagia Soumela. We would also like to thank those members of the media who are present tonight, Ms. Vaso Morali, Head of the Greek Language Radio SBS, Mr. Spiros Papastefanou of 2MM, and Mr. Yannis Dramatinos of the Hellenic Herald. I will also later acknowledge all those who could not make it this evening, but have nevertheless sent their messages of support. As we will hear from our speakers tonight, commemorations such as this are held all over the world during the month of May to mark the loss of so many innocent lives and the destruction of an Indigenous culture in its native land. In the aftermath of the Armenian and Assyrian genocides, the Ottoman Turkish state turned its sights on the last Indigenous Christian population in eastern Anatolia, the Greeks of the Black Sea coast, the Greeks of Pontos. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately Miss Sophie Kotsis had to leave us earlier, so Mr. Robert Ferrolo, can I call on you to say a few words on behalf of Sophie?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I just acknowledge His Excellency, the Consul General, Mr. Tolios and his wife, Father Nicholas, parliamentary colleagues, too many to mention, Mr. Dimitrios Kouklidis, President of the United Pontian Benevolent Brotherhood, representatives from local councils, ladies and gentlemen. I know that Sophie was disappointed that she had to head off back to the chamber to participate in debate, but I know that she would have wanted everyone here to feel very welcome at the New South Wales Parliament to mark today's special event. I'm very pleased to see so many familiar faces from our local communities represented here today, and I know that this evening's event will be one of an opportunity to remind us of the importance of getting together and remembering the events of our past, and to acknowledge those who lost their lives as a result. I know that Sophie was disappointed that she couldn't remain for the rest of the evening. She hopes to come back if the parliamentary debate allows her, but this issue that she's debating tonight is obviously... I'd like to, on behalf of Sophie and all of the parliamentarians who are here this evening, welcome you to the New South Wales Parliament, and hope that we enjoy tonight's proceedings. Thank you.
I would now like to welcome the Honourable David Clark to say a few brief words.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honour to be here as Parliamentary Secretary for Justice in the Government of New South Wales and representing Barry O'Farrell, the Premier of the State of New South Wales, at this annual Pontian Greek Genocide commemoration organised by the United Pontian Benevolent Brotherhood Association of New South Wales. And we have here representatives of the Armenian community, because when the genocide was committed against the Pontian Greeks in that period of 1913 to 1923 in Turkey, they were murdered as well. And we have representatives of the Assyrian community because they are among the victims of the genocide that took place there. We have representatives of the Jewish community because in a few short years after what happened in that part of Turkey, they suffered themselves in that massive Holocaust that took place. And there are many others here today who are not Armenian or Pontian Greek or Assyrian, from many different backgrounds, but we're all here united because we are opposed and we will resist as strongly as we can genocide, no matter who commits it and no matter who it's committed against, no matter when and no matter where. In that we are all united as one here today in this Parliament of New South Wales. And history is very, very clear that there was this massive genocide against the Assyrians and the Armenians, and it was very clear that there was a massive genocide against the Pontian Greeks as well. History is very clear, and truth is very clear, and the facts are very clear. For 3,000 years, there was a thriving Greek community in that area known as Pontus in present-day Turkey. There was a great kingdom in the 4th century BC under King Mithridates. After the visit of St. Andrew in AD 35, that Greek civilization became a Greek Christian civilization. It's a civilization that thrived and prospered and grew. It was an Hellenic civilization. It was a Christian civilization that shines with a special luster in the history books today. Then in the 15th century, something happened. This area was conquered by the Ottoman Turks, and there followed a number of centuries of discrimination and religious cleansing and persecution, forced conversions, but at least that was a community that more or less survived. Then we came to the 20th century, and things changed dramatically. Things got a lot worse. And it can be summed up as to what happened by a letter sent in 1909 by the German ambassador in Turkey to the German Chancellor. And this is what he said. He said, "The Turks have decided upon a war of extermination against their Christian subjects." By that he meant the Assyrians and the Armenians and the Pontian Greeks all together. And that got underway in 1913, and it reached its full force in 1923. And the houses of these people were burnt to the ground, and they were herded into concentration camps. They had their churches desecrated. They were killed through starvation and forced marches. They were killed by being burnt alive in their churches. They were killed in a campaign of premeditated murder, which was executed to its fullest. And in that genocide, 1.5 million Armenians died, 2/3 of all us Assyrians died, and between 400,000 and 600,000 Pontian Greeks, they died in those massacres as well. And in this very parliament, up in the parliamentary garden, we have a monument to the Armenian people commemorating that genocide of the Armenians. And in this parliament we've had commemorations by the Assyrian community in this very theatrette. And today in this parliament, the Parliament of the people of New South Wales, this oldest parliament in Australia, this oldest parliament in the Southern Hemisphere, today is the very first time that in this parliament we commemorate the genocide of the Pontian Greeks as well. And tonight I applaud the United Pontian Brotherhood for what they have done by instituting this, and long may it continue here in the Parliament of the people of New South Wales. Is this not, dear friends, an historic event? Is this not a wonderful occasion? Is this not a testament to justice and humanity and to the memory of those hundreds of thousands of Pontian Greek men, women and children who were murdered by the state of Turkey in those years, nearly 90 years ago, 100 years ago? But above all, friends, what we're doing tonight is a testament to truth. It's a testament that the truth is not going to be subverted and twisted. It's a testament to the fact that we're not going to allow the rewriting of history or the denial of history. And to the revisionists out there, we say this: admit to the truth of what's happened. The whole world knows what's happened, and to do that would be a noble thing, a good thing, a moral thing, and a decent thing. Let justice be done. Let the memory of those victims rest in peace. And for sure, one thing is for sure, that the parliamentarians in this place, from whether they're from the government or they're from the opposition or whether they're from the crossbench, and they're all represented here tonight, we are always going to be here to welcome you and to support the commemoration that you want to have on this day. We want you to be here. When you ask us to come, we will come. When you ask us to speak, we will speak. And nothing can stop us, and nothing will stop us. All over the world, people and nations are starting to speak up and testifying to the truth. And today in this Parliament, we are going to speak up and testify to the truth as well. Thank you very much.
I would now also welcome Mr. David Shoebridge to say a few brief words.
Welcome as well from behalf of the New South Wales Greens to the New South Wales Parliament. I'd first like to acknowledge the land we're meeting on tonight is the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And in large part, I'd like to echo the words of my parliamentary colleague, David Clark. And I acknowledge we have many parliamentarians from many different political parties here today. I see Walt Secord from the ALP, I see Fred Nile from the Christian Democrats. David, of course, spoke on behalf of the Liberal National Government, and I speak to you on behalf of the New South Wales Greens. And can I say, in this Parliament, in the chamber that I spend my time in, the upper house here in New South Wales, but I acknowledge also we've got Gladys here, Gladys Berejiklian, the Transport Minister. I know there's another voice down there in the lower house, as is Robert, in the lower house. It doesn't matter what political party you're from. It doesn't matter whether you're Green or Liberal or Labor. We all join together to acknowledge and speak the truth about genocide. And I think for myself, when you have a parliament, we often have disparate voices on many other things. We will tonight, after this commemoration, go and have a real political battle about other legislation that comes before this parliament. But on this issue, on the acknowledgement of the truth of the Armenian, the Greek and the Assyrian genocide, we do genuinely all join together. And we're here today to say we will never forget, and we will be blind to politics when we stand in front of you, united as your parliament here in New South Wales, to say we will never forget. And we acknowledge the truth of history. And I say that only 500 metres from my home is the Turkish consulate. And when I made a contribution to the Parliament on the Armenian genocide, very soon after that I got a missive from the Turkish consulate attacking my contribution. And my response to our friends in Turkey is, if we are to be friends, and we are strong and solid friends of the people of Turkey, let's have that friendship founded on truth. Let's have that friendship founded on an acknowledgement of the reality of history, on the acknowledgement of the genocide that was committed against the Greeks, against the Armenians and against the Assyrians in those years during and following the First World War. Because true friends should be honest with each other. True friends should have that friendship founded upon an acknowledgement of history. And some years ago, this Parliament passed a resolution that acknowledged the truth of the Armenian genocide. And we're here today, you're here, for us not to forget and to commemorate and acknowledge the truth of the Greek genocide. And I say to you now, in the same spirit, blind to partisan politics, I will work with my other parliamentary colleagues in my chamber so that 12 months from now, we can stand before you and say, this Parliament, again, blind to politics, has also acknowledged the truth and the reality of the Greek genocide. Thank you very much for coming.
Would the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile like to come up and say a few words?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I've only just been asked to bring a brief greeting to you, and I'd like to indicate my total support for the aims of this meeting tonight as we remember what happened to the Greek community in Turkey, in that region of Pontus, that we never forget the genocide and keep the whole issue alive and keep that issue before the Turkish government as well, who are in a state of denial, and to convince them, and I believe I'm a very positive person, that we will convince them at some stage to acknowledge the genocide of the Greeks in that Pontus region and also of the Assyrians and the Armenians. I've been very pleased to share many of the meetings with the Assyrians and the Armenians and the building of the Assyrian monument to genocide in Fairfield, and to take part in other activities. And I commit myself to give my total support through the Christian Democratic Party to all your endeavours. I recently attended a reception with the President of the House of Representatives from Cyprus, and he was sharing the persecution of the Greeks today, and what's happening in Cyprus, the destruction of churches and the forced removal of Greek families from the areas that they have inhabited for thousands of years. And so, in a sense, genocide is still happening today, even as we meet. So we must always be vigilant and not allow these things to happen and to be repeated again in any future history. So God bless you, each one.
As the Federal Parliament is sitting in Canberra this week, we have apologies from both members of the Senate and the House of Representatives who are regrettably unable to be with us tonight. Senator Nick Xenophon from South Australia was unable to be with us tonight. However, he has sent the following message. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to the members of the United Pontian Benevolence Brotherhood for their invitation to address you all tonight on the solemn occasion of commemorating the Hellenic, Armenian and Assyrian genocides. I apologise for not being able to make this address in person. Unfortunately, my parliamentary commitments preclude me from being with you tonight. I thank myself for presenting this speech on his behalf. US Congressman Jerry Costello once said, "Genocide is the most potent of all crimes against humanity because it is an effort to systematically wipe out a people and a culture as well as individual lives." We come together tonight not just to mourn and commemorate those who lost their lives, but to remind ourselves of how far we have come and how far we still have to go. More and more countries across the world are formally recognising these past atrocities as genocide. Australia is yet to do so. For too many years, people scared of political repercussions have relied on a game of semantics to avoid taking a stand on this issue. There have been too many discussions of legal versus historical definitions, of specific intention versus circumstance, of who is on what side. All of these arguments forget the most important point. Over 3.5 million people died as a result of the deliberate, systematic actions of the Ottoman Empire. The Hellenic, Armenian and Assyrian people endured forced marches into the desert with little or no food or water, and imprisonment in so-called relocation camps, which were effective concentration camps. Ottoman troops also massacred countless victims in vicious attacks on cities and local villages. These attacks included mass drownings, burnings, and poisonings. Tonight, we come together to remember these victims, who are so often forgotten by those who seek to avoid this debate. Because this isn't about semantics, about definitions or intentions or sides. It's about the millions of people who lost their lives and those who seek to honour their memory. And it's time for the Australian government to join us in acknowledging these terrible wrongs. We also have apologies from Senator Arthur Sinodinos from New South Wales, the Honourable Joel Fitzgibbon, Member for Hunter and Chief Government Whip, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, Member for Bradfield, Mr Scott Morrison, Federal Member for Cook and Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, the Honourable Tony Burke, Minister for Sustainability, Environment, Water, Population and Communities, the Honourable Robert McClellan, Federal Member for Barton, the Honourable Mr Laurie Ferguson, Federal Member for Werriwa, the Honourable Mr Malcolm Turnbull, Federal Member for Wentworth, and finally Mr John Alexander, Federal Member for Bennelong, was kind enough to send us this message. Thank you for kindly inviting me to attend the annual Pontian Genocide commemoration on Wednesday, 9 May 2012. Unfortunately, I am unable to attend due to parliamentary commitments in Canberra. I strongly support the recognition of the Hellenic, Armenian and Assyrian genocides from 1915 to 1923, which I have spoken about in Parliament 3 times since my election. On 21st of November, I made a speech recognising the genocides and strong efforts of the Armenian National Committee Australia, Australian Hellenic Council and Assyrian Universal Alliance. I was proud to coordinate 3 of my parliamentary colleagues, Joe Hockey, Malcolm Turnbull and Craig Kelly, to follow my speech with their own acknowledgements of these atrocities. Whilst I cannot attend your function, I am proudly supporting commemoration events in the Bennelong community in the coming weeks. I hope that all these events assist us to travel towards a goal of formally recognising these historical atrocities. I would appreciate if you could keep me in mind for future events. I wish you and the Pondoxeniteas Brotherhood all the best for the commemoration event. Please pass on my message of support to your colleagues. We thank them all for their interest and unfailing support, especially those members who have publicly acknowledged the historical reality of the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian genocide and have urged the Australian government to recognise this crime against humanity. We also have apologies from Councillor Nick Vavaris, Mayor of Kogarah, and Mr Yair Miller, President, New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. It is always heartening to see our youth participating in an event such as today's. We will now hear 2 poems from Dimitri Paneris and George Yakumaros.
The Lost Homeland, Pontos, by Pavlos Kezidis. Life in Pontos changed forever when the Turkish knife drilled through the Pontic Greek heart. The Greek genocide began, thousands of innocents murdered, churches burned. Life in Pontos changed forever when the Pontic music and dancing stopped and the endless death marches across the Anatolian desert began. Life in Pontos changed forever when the Turkish knife drilled through the Pontic Greek heart.
When Memory Has a Right, by Dr. Irma Vasiliou. Just how long injustice continues, a holy Pontian knows, as to how the hollow earth underfoot still stands. Ask a kindly Armenian, ask them all, even the Assyrian, whose uprooting is still love, silently and philosophically, awaiting reconciliation. Just how long injustice prevails, a Pontian knows, yet everywhere there is silence. We did not even see it in our dream or take pleasure in a single word. Only memory stands, only memory is granted an audience today. Not a centimetre was lost from our land, nor has the Pontian ceased his search for justice. I swear this to you by the light of my own eyes. We still wait for everything. We must, everything.
Hi, can I also ask Alexandra Yakumaros to come up on stage?
Ο θρήνος της τραπεζούντας. Έναν πουλίν, καλόν πουλίν, έβγαινε από την πόλη. Ουδές τα μπέλα κόνεψε, ουδές τα περιβόλα. Έπηγεν και κόναψεν, σαγιά σοφιά στην πόρταν. Έσυξεν τεν αυτοφτερόν, στο αίμα βουτεμένον. Έσυξεν τ' άλλο το φτερόν, χαρτίν ισχύον γραμμένον. Σίτα ναγνώθ, σίτα κλαίει, σίτα κρούει την καρδίαν. Αηλίε μας και βάε μας, πάρθεν η Ρωμανία. Μυρολογούν τα εκκλησίες, κλαίει τα μοναστήρα. Κι Αγιάννης ο Χρυσόστομον, κλαίει δερνοκοπιέται. Μη κλαις Αγιάννη μου, και δερνοκοπιέσαι. Η Ρωμανία πέρασεν, η Ρωμανία πάρθεν. Η Ρωμανία κι αν πέρασεν, ανθεί και φέρει κι άλλο.
The Honourable Michael Atkinson. Are you over? Oh. It is a great honour to introduce our next speaker, who has travelled from Adelaide to be with us today.
My parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in a sense I was accidentally thrust into this historical controversy when I was asked as Minister for Multicultural Affairs in South Australia to unveil a plaque to the Pontian genocide on the wall of the Migration Museum in Adelaide. I was invited by friends and I did it cheerfully, knowing, having read the history and knowing that this was an entirely appropriate thing for a Minister and Member of Parliament to do. But I was quite surprised by the reaction from the Turkish government, by the Turkish embassy in Canberra. I began to receive emails of the kind that Mr Shoebridge described. And then, to my surprise, I was denounced by a fellow South Australian politician, Senator Ferguson, in an after-dinner speech in the federal parliament, and the argument ran along the lines the genocide wasn't really a genocide, and secondly, if it were, it happened so long ago, and we are such good friends with the Republic of Turkey that no one should be talking about it. Well, this led to quite an interesting debate in South Australia, and it meant that what was to the general public an obscure controversy became a hot topic, and we took up prime time on ABC radio as the protagonists of this controversy slugged it out. And I think that was a very good thing to bring it to the forefront of public attention, and that probably wouldn't have happened but for Senator Ferguson's speech. I think Mr Shoebridge was not quite right when he said that all members of Parliament and all parties stand with us on this question. I came to the New South Wales Parliament for the first time in the 1990s to visit my friend John Hatzistegos, and while I was waiting for him I watched from proceedings from the gallery, and I was surrounded by people who were speaking Turkish amongst themselves, and I wondered why they were there. It must have been the motion that was mentioned earlier, and a member of the New South Wales Parliament got up and flatly denied the genocide and argued that if something unpleasant did occur, we certainly shouldn't be talking about it because it would be offensive to the Turkish community and to our friends, the Republic of Turkey. Well, of course, that's not the right view to take. I think Mr Clark, when he mentioned earlier the evidence of Turkey's allies, the diplomats of Austria-Hungary and Germany at the time, is the most, some of the best evidence that it was a genocide and that it did occur as we argued. Subsequently, I formulated a parliamentary motion on the matter, and that was carried by both houses of the South Australian Parliament. And indeed, after that, I travelled to Greece and visited Agios Oros with my friend Nui, and spoke before a rally of thousands of Greek people in Hagia Sophia Square in Thessaloniki. And for me, that was, I think, the high point of my time in public life. You certainly couldn't get thousands of Australians to come out for a historical or political discussion, but you can get thousands of Greeks out, and they're very, very enthusiastic about it. And I thank you for your friendship all these past years.
I would now like to call upon Mr. Nikolas Christosomidis, President of the Federation of Pontian Associations in Australia, to address you tonight.
Distinguished guests and friends of the Pontian Greek community of New South Wales, the 19th of May 1919 is commemorated by the Pontian Greeks all around the world for respect of those Greeks that lost their lives in Pontos region of Anatolia, current-day Republic of Turkey, the Black Sea region. The Greek genocide amounts to upwards from 1 million people that were lost between 1914 and 1923. At the early part of the last century, the word genocide didn't exist, as the United Nations Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of Crime of Genocide was only adopted in 1948. Article 2 of the Convention defines genocide. Genocide. There is no other word for what happened to the Greeks, Armenians and Assyrians, the peoples of Anatolia. In 1918, Turkey lost the war. A 4-year Turco-German alliance ended. Genocide was the price that was paid. By 1923, over 3.5 million Greek, Armenian and Assyrians were annihilated in a frenzy of mass murders. The secret genocide in Turkey became a part of the German collective memory. And within a generation, Germany, in part, became involved in crimes against humanity, the Jewish Holocaust. Adolf Hitler, on the 22nd of August, 1939, said this: "Who remembers today the extermination of the Armenians?" We can say the same of the Greeks and the Assyrians. The aftermath of the Greek, Armenian and Assyrian genocide saw hundreds of thousands of survivors of the genocide displaced from their ancestral lands. These people told their stories to the world, and a plethora of information of survivors' accounts and media of the time exists. I would like to remind you all of a resolution passed by the International Association of Genocide Scholars of 2007 affirming the 1914-1923 massacres and death marches of Ottoman Greeks was genocide. The resolution also affirmed the Armenian and Assyrian genocides. The resolution is as follows: whereas the denial of genocide is widely recognised as the final stage of genocide, enshrining impunity for the perpetrators of genocide and demonstrably paving the way for future genocides. Whereas the Ottoman genocide against minority populations during and following the First World War is actually depicted as a genocide against Armenians alone, with little recognition of the qualitatively similar genocides against the Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire. Be it resolved that in the conviction of the International Association of Genocide Scholars that the Ottoman campaign against Christian minorities of the empire between 1914 and 1923 constituted a genocide against Armenians, Assyrians and Pontian and Anatolian Greeks. Be it further resolved that the association calls upon the government of Turkey to acknowledge the genocides against these populations, to issue a formal apology and to take prompt and meaningful steps towards restitution. Today, Turkey steadfastly denies to recognise the genocide of the Greeks, Armenians and Assyrians. Turkey is responsible for these acts of genocide, whether willingly or unwillingly. We struggle to ask for a point out of the truth. In order not to repeat these crimes, the responsibility and the reasons that led them have to be found out. The truth must be sought and presented. Nowadays, when other nations suffer genocides from racist states, we do not different. My apologies. We do no different. It is time for the first step to be taken to recognise the crime of Greek and Assyrian genocides in the New South Wales Parliament. But we also call upon the Federal Parliament to recognise the Greek, Armenian and Assyrian genocides. On the other hand, the contemporary Turkish state has to answer for the Greek, Armenian and Assyrian genocides. Without making propaganda and pleas of inconsistency as a state in order to be exculpated from the charge. This state, as the creation of Mustafa Kemal and the Young Turks, are responsible for the crime of genocide. The greater the harm and the longer the facts are hidden, the more intense the desire for such a recognition. Recognition is a substantial way to fight against genocide. Recognition, which constitutes the confirmation of a nation's right to the respect of its existence according to the international law. This historical truth is a historical reality. Commemoration, recognition, reparations are the last acts of healing to those people who were affected by the genocide. Thank you.
Professor Colin Tatz is our keynote speaker today. Professor Colin Tatz was born in South Africa, arriving in Australia in 1960 in order to study governmental management of Aboriginal affairs. His list of publications are far too numerous to elaborate here, covering such diverse topics as the history of the Monash Country Club, Australian Aboriginal athletes, the Jewish Holocaust, Aboriginal Australian genocide, suicide and other health issues amongst Indigenous populations in Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and denial of genocide. Professor Tatz has dedicated his illustrious career to the understanding and teaching of hatred and genocide, developing genocide studies courses at a number of Australian universities, including the University of Technology, Sydney. In 1998, under Professor Tatz's leadership and with the sponsorship of the Pontian Greek Associations in Sydney, the Centre for Comparative Genocide Studies at Macquarie University became the world's first to incorporate research and teaching of the Greek genocide into its programs. The Genocide Studies programs, initiated by Professor Tatz, educate hundreds of secondary and tertiary students each year about the Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian genocides. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our great honour to present tonight's keynote speaker, a true friend of Hellenism, Professor Colin Tatz.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, what are we here for? We're here to commemorate a particular event. Last month, there was a commemoration in Sydney and right across the country, and in fact, worldwide, of the Jewish Holocaust. There were commemoration ceremonies in this room and at the Willoughby Town Hall for the Armenian genocide. And now, not last by any means, the commemoration of what happened to the Assyrians, to the Pontian Greek, as well as the Armenians. What we need to look at is the victim. The victims were victims because of who they were. They were chosen because they were Jews, or because they were Armenians, or because they were Greek, or because they were Assyrian Christians. They weren't just victimized because they were a particular group that happened to be in the way of whatever the particular problem was. The Genocide Convention insists that genocide has to be a systematic attack on a particular group because they are that group. The people we are commemorating tonight were members of that group. We have a problem in a number of communities, and I just want to raise this in passing very briefly. When Hitler attacked Jews, he wanted to systematically annihilate a particular group of people as a favor to the world. He didn't say Orthodox Jews, he didn't say progressive or Reform Jews, he didn't say secular Jews or agnostic Jews, or apostate Jews who'd given up their faith. He didn't say Zionists or anti-Zionists, he said Jews. Now, in life, we are accustomed, as I'm a member of that Jewish group, to infighting, to fractions, to bitternesses, to hostilities. The tragedy for all of us who belong to an ethnic minority is that the only time there is unity in death. And I always say to Jewish audiences, when it comes to Yom HaShoah, the commemoration day in April, usually, the perpetrators didn't single out particular groups of Jews for destruction. They picked on all Jews. The Turks didn't single out Pontians just simply because they lived in the area known as Pontus, but it was because they were Greeks. And they picked on Assyrians because they were Assyrian Christians. And they picked on Armenians because they were Armenians. So please, I hope that in this talk and in talks to come, we will kind of give up the notion that seems to be not prevalent, but it crops up from time to time, that a particular commemoration belongs to one geographic group and doesn't belong to the totality of that group. Okay, what is genocide? We have a problem with genocide because the popular conception of genocide that most of us have grown up with, certainly the younger generation have grown up with, is people in striped pajamas hanging off the wire at a place called Auschwitz. It is also a graphic depiction of what happened in 100 days in Kigali in Rwanda. It is pictures, stark pictures, reminiscent of the Holocaust that we see in the depiction of what happened in Kosovo and in Bosnia. So what we're left with is a popular image, which is a wrong image, that genocide is merely or simply or only the killing of people. And if it didn't involve killing, then it must be something else. But the Genocide Convention, which was worked at long and hard by a number of delegates, including the man, he wasn't a delegate, but he was the founder of the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish jurist, lawyer, listed 5 separate acts that constitute the crime of genocide. And the first one is the obvious one, killing members of a particular group because they are members of that group. Secondly, causing serious bodily and mental harm to a group, but it doesn't specify the nature of the physical and mental harm, but you can guess what it means. Thirdly, bringing about conditions of life that are likely to destroy those people, slave labor camps, deportations, ethnic cleansing, and so on. Fourthly, sterilization of children or people in a group so that they can't reproduce themselves. And finally, the forcible removal of children from one group to another. And hereby hangs a problem, because when people like myself write about the Aboriginal genocide and talk about the systematic removal of children, people say that can't be genocide because it doesn't look like Auschwitz, and it doesn't look like Kigali, and it doesn't look like Sarajevo. But it is genocide. And while people rail against the co-equation of those 5 acts, saying the one is killing, but the other, the children are still alive, they may have been removed, but they're still alive, nevertheless, removing children in that way, and this happened very clearly in the Turkish case, is an act of genocide. Now, for years teaching genocide studies courses at Macquarie and elsewhere, I used to talk to my students and sort of muttered under my breath that we need some kind of a Richter scale. We need some kind of a measuring rod which will distinguish the various cases of genocide. And a Richter scale, as you know, is Charles Richter, a seismologist who discovers a way of measuring the magnitude of earthquakes. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we have the equivalent of a 10 logarithm number to measure the scale of genocide, but we need something. We need something that will help us encompass what happened in Australia over a period of 124 years, the physical killing and the removal of children, and what happened in Rwanda in 100 days. Can you equate, can you encompass those two things? Yes, you can, and you have to do it by devising a scale, which I just for convenience called a Richter scale, and I'm very happy to report that after the Armenian commemoration events last month, the visiting guest speaker, Henry Tiriel from Worcester State University in Boston, has agreed to join me in writing a major paper, I hope it'll be a major paper, on the need for a Richter scale. And I share just a few thoughts with you about this. We need to approach it in 6 categories. The first category is the precursors, the prerequisites, the precedents, what went before the actual events. What is the history of violence and antagonism towards a group? The second category is the actual genocide events themselves. The third category is to look at the immediate post-genocide analysis, just trying to come to terms with what it was that actually happened. Fourthly, we need to look at the aftermath, and the aftermath includes things like trials, prosecutions, trying to find out who was accountable, who was responsible. We then need to look at things like the legacies. And the legacies are terribly important because we tend to forget the legacies. We're here tonight to commemorate a legacy. The legacy, as Henry Tiriel explained in this room less than a month ago, is that the genocidal events may have occurred 95 years ago. They may have occurred 65 years ago. The legacy is alive here in this room right now. The legacy does not go away. People are killed in the killing fields, or people are attacked systematically in various regions. But the legacies go down to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and down to the generations. As my friend Henry Tiriel said, we not only have to consider the living when we talk about legacies, we have to consider those who are unborn. That may sound a little bit odd, but think of the legions of people who were not born. Think of the legions of people who not only were not born, but in turn did not give birth to the next generation of people. The legacy is also a terrible one. A terrible one, as Henry pointed out, of a power imbalance. And the power imbalance is that a minority of people, Assyrians, Armenians, Pontian Greeks, suffered at the hands of a powerful perpetrator. And you still do. The power imbalance that occurred physically in the killing fields is still there today. Turkey says we didn't do it. Turkey is big and powerful. Pontian Greek minorities are a minority. Armenians are a minority, both in Armenia and in their diaspora. The Assyrians an even smaller minority. In the power table, sitting around at a conference, as Henry has suggested, that we need to perhaps rethink the whole notion of the aftermath in terms of reparations and seeking 3 things. Either giving back the givable, or B, restoring the restorable, such as churches, or C, in the event that you can't give back and that you can't restore, then you need to make financial compensation. We haven't yet got to the stage of talking about those ideas, but even if we do get to that stage of talking about them, how do you sit at a table with a powerful Republic of Turkey while you are in the minority status that you're in? This is a problem, and this is a legacy. The other thing we have to look at is the outcomes. What has this genocide done to the psyche, to the souls of the people who were victims? The living victims, the living survivors, the living generations. There is a deep, deep scar which doesn't go away. One of the problems associated with that scar is that minority communities begin to define themselves only as victims of a genocide. They have a long, long history that goes back to antiquity. What happened to that history? What happened to the Greek traditions from my friends Plato and Aristotle, whom I studied so carefully when I was a university student? What happens to the legacy of the Hellenic Empire and the Hellenic civilization? Is all this suddenly torn asunder because there was a catastrophic event between 1913 and 1924? My friend Conrad Queet, a noted Holocaust historian, always laments, and rightly so, that a lot of Jewish communities have come to define themselves in terms of their victimness and their victimhood as a result of the Holocaust. What happened to 5,000 years of Jewish civilization? What's happened to that? And here we have to really seriously think, not about diminishing or putting aside the genocide, but taking stock about the other attributes, the other achievements, the other brilliance of those civilizations that are still a legacy for the world. I'm very pleased to say that my friend Henry Theriault has agreed with me. We will do a lot of research and we will do a lot of work in trying to bring together a scale, a template, by which we can adjudicate, make some kind of judgments about cases that appear to be so different in scale, in method, in purpose, in outcomes, in aftermath. Now, we know that 350,000 Pontian Greeks, 250,000 Assyrians, and 1.5 million Armenians were killed by the Turks. And it is now fortunate that we are seeing the beginnings of a Turkish revolt, very small, but very important and very powerful, of young Turkish scholars beginning to address the whole issue and questioning the whole history of their state. And if truth is going to emerge, it is more likely to happen through the activities of, I don't want to use that word, I won't say young Turks because they were the bad guys, youngish Turks who will take up the cudgels rather than trying to get Turkey to bow to external pressure. And a new book came onto the market this month. Taner Aksam, who's a brilliant Turkish student now living in the United States, has just published a book, The Young Turks' Crime Against Humanity, The Armenian Genocide and Ethnic Cleansing in the Ottoman Empire. I haven't read the book yet. I've only read little snippets of it because it's only just appeared in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But when people like Aksam begin to write cosmic, huge canvas histories of what happened at the hands of the Turks, we're beginning to see the beginning of something very significant. But I've come here tonight essentially to talk to you about denialism. And the question is, what is denialism? It sounds simple. But just as there is a Richter scale needed to look at the levels and degrees and gradations of genocide, so we need a kind of Richter scale with which to look at denialism, because denialism is in different grades as well. There's a man called Stanley Cohen, who's an English sociologist, British sociologist, who wrote a book some years ago called The State of Denial. And his definition of denialism is, he calls it the politics of ethnic amnesia. Lovely phrase. And there's a lot of politics about ethnic amnesia. Nowhere better illustrated than in some of the comments we've already heard this evening. But let's look very briefly at the scales that are involved in denialism. The first, and not necessarily in this order, is relativizing. That is, your genocide is not as bad as my genocide, which wasn't as bad as his genocide, etc. So you relativize, you make it relative. Bigger, smaller, smallest, largest, first, second, third, and so on and so forth. The second one is ghastly, trivializing the Holocaust or genocide. It was only, say some Holocaust deniers, only 3 million Jews, not 6 million, only 3 million, or only 250,000 criminals who were put to death, justifiably so, say the denialists. That word only is a very mischievous word. It trivializes everything. The third one is a form of what I call flattening. What does flattening mean? Well, okay, everybody does it, so why are you picking on me, Turkey? Everybody commits genocide, so what's so special about the Turkish one? So you don't now have peaks of denialism, you don't have peaks of genocide. If everybody does it, then there is a universality about this activity which makes it normal. Deflecting. Yes, what is deflecting? Turks are very good at deflecting. You lost 1.5 million Armenians and you lost 350,000 Pontian Greeks, but we lost more. The casualties amongst the Turks were greater than the number of victims of the so-called genocide. So why are you making out a case because we are the ones who should be pleading for apologies and so on? There is another form of denialism. It's called appropriating. Appropriating in law means stealing. You steal somebody else's history. So what becomes the Christian minority victimhood at the hands of Turkey in the Near East becomes Turkish history. And it's very easy to, the only people who don't do this, I must say, are the Germans. There is distorting as another form of denialism. What is distorting? Distorting is, well, you've got to look at the context. And we've already heard from South Australian Senator Ferguson, bad things happen. There was a civil war. War is terrible. War is horrible. People die in war. We lost X million Turks, you lost Y million Christians. So, okay, let's level the playing field. There is another one. In law, it's called Tuquoque. Tuquoque, T-U-Q-U-O-Q-U-E, means you also did it. So why are you picking on me? You did it. So, okay, we both did it together, or all three of us did it together, or 20 of us did it together, and that kind of normalizes the situation. There is forgetting. Now, to forget, especially at my age, is very easy. I don't know where my car keys are, and I don't know where various documents are, and one forgets. It's just one of those inevitable things that occurs as a loss of memory with the aging process. Okay. But to forget in the sense of not knowing where your car keys are is not the same as forgetting in this denialist context. There's a man called David Dissenhouse, who's a very esteemed professor of jurisprudence and the philosophy of law, Toronto University. He's a South African, who went to Toronto some years ago. And in the 1990s, he went back to South Africa as a lawyer to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings to see what was happening to the concept of justice after the end of, so-called end of apartheid. And he has an unforgettable line in this. I'll see if I can find it. He says, Forgetting is a social and political action. In these national contexts, it requires a deliberate decision from the vantage of one who in fact remembers. So that forgetting in this Turkish sense is a conscious and deliberate act of forgetting by people who in fact remember only too well what it is that happened, because it's been documented from A to Z. There is another form, outright denial. It never happened. It never happened. The Turks have at least moved a little bit from outright denial to the various other shades that I've already mentioned, to relativizing, to trivializing, to flattening, and so on. There are very few Turks today who say nothing happened. How can they ever have thought they could get away with saying that nothing happened? We've already had a reference from Mr. Clark that there were German and Austrian missionaries, especially a man called Dr. Lepsius, who was a German missionary, who gave first-hand accounts. Remember that people could send telegrams even in those days, and they sent the telegrams. They sent the telegrams to newspapers as far as Maitland. We've had some of the things on the screen here, the Gisborne Times or the Gippsland Times or whatever it is. These were messages that were broadcast around the world at the particular time. We have that still very readable and incredible book by Henry Morgenthau, who was the American ambassador to Turkey in those fateful years beginning in 1913. He left in 1916, end of 1916, saying he could stand it no longer. He had daily consultations with Enver Pasha, Kemal Pasha, Talat Pasha, the triumvirate who basically put the genocide into operation. They came to his offices, he went to their homes. And he gives a more personal account than can ever be achieved by anybody in the book called The Ambassador's Story, which you should read if you haven't read it. Ninthly, we have the intention of hurting. There's a famous French classical scholar called Pierre Vidal-Naquet, who wrote a book with a very powerful title. It's called The Assassins of Memory. And it's a marvelously apt title for denialists, The Assassins of Memory. And he says, denialists are intent on striking a community in the 1,000 painful fibers that continue to link it to its own past. 1,000 painful fibers. I think the answer is 1,000,000 painful fibers. That if you really dislike, hate, have an antipathy, an abhorrence for the victims, what you do is not only do you kill them in the killing fields, but then you kill them in the history books by saying it didn't happen to them, or they invented it. And finally, there is the need by perpetrators, again with the exception of modern Germany, to sustain the power imbalance that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, what about free speech? A year ago, a journalist for whom I have no time, no respect, and no regard, by the name of Andrew Bolt, writes in one of the Melbourne newspapers about a group of 8 named Aborigines whom he says are light-skinned, apparent Aborigines who are milking the funding system for all they can get out of it. And something has got to be done to expose this blackmail by people who are not really Aborigines. A woman called Pat Eatock, who was once a student of mine at Macquarie, is now crippled, I think, in a wheelchair, rightly takes umbrage, and she goes to court and she protests that this is contrary to the Racial Discrimination Act. It goes before Justice Bromberg in September 2011. And the judge rules that Bolt's 2 articles breached the Racial Discrimination Act because his attack was, quote, calculated to offend, quote, inflamed negative views, quote, omitted crucial information, and was full of errors. Whereupon Andrew Bolt shrieked, as did some of his colleagues, that this was the beginning of the erosion of free speech in Australia. The Shadow Attorney General, George Brandis, claimed that a Liberal coalition government, when it comes to power, would repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act because there's no room in our society for a law which prohibits vilification and incitement to racial hatred. Rhetoric, did he mean it? Would he say it again if he had a second chance? I don't know. But it's very, very interesting that not only a man who is seemingly adored by a certain section of the population, he seems to be on a hell of a lot of television lately, and a man of Brandis's standing should say there is no room for an anti-vilification law or a race hatred law in this country in the name of free speech. Now, where does all this come from? It comes from what the Americans call First Amendment jurisprudence. The American Constitution, which is a very fine document in many ways, has a Bill of Rights contained in it. And the Bill of Rights says, and I'll read from this, the First Amendment to the American Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So, the key clause, there shall be no abridgment of the freedom of speech or of the press. And there are legions of court cases in the United States based on First Amendment jurisprudence. It's very important stuff, except this is Australia and not America, and we don't have such a clause in our Constitution. What is free speech? It is a phrase trumpeted again and again and again, and particularly in university circles where I'm very familiar with cries of interference with academic freedom and so on and so forth. There was a man in our midst some years ago, died, a man of possibly flawed character, or probably of flawed character, who became a High Court judge, but a very good one. His name was Lionel Murphy. And he left some outstanding judgments in his wake for all the lawyers to read in law school and elsewhere. And he made a remarkable statement in one of his judgments. Listen carefully. Free speech is only what is left after due weight has been accorded to the laws relating to defamation, to blasphemy, to copyright, to sedition, to obscenity, the use of insulting words, official secrets, contempt of court and parliament, incitement and censorship. That's what's left over, is free speech. One of the things you learn in law school, which I once attended, in first year, very first lecture in criminal law, you're not allowed to shout the word fire in a crowded theatre. Why? It's free speech. I want to cry fire in this parliamentary theatre. I'm not allowed to do so because it'll cause stampede and panic and possible injury and possible death. There are no such things as absolute rights. And Andrew Bolt needs a lesson in elementary civics to know that there is no absolute right, neither here nor in the American Constitution or in the land of America, where you can reside where you want to reside, where you can say what you want to say, and you can practice whatever religion you want to practice, including, say, killing of infants. Infanticide may be part of a religion, or polygamy. So there are always limits to free speech. And what is involved here tonight on this commemoration is, can we, should we outlaw denialism? Okay. 18 countries around the world have made it a criminal offense to deny the Holocaust. I'll read you the list. It's an interesting list. Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Czech Republic, France. I'm not talking about the recent problem with the French law about outlawing denialism. This is denying the Holocaust. France, Germany, as you would expect, Hungary, Israel, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Spain, and Switzerland. The point about these laws in those countries is that, much contrary to the views of a respected friend of mine, and he is a friend of mine, but we differ violently on this issue, Philip Adams, who says you can't put people in jail for mere words. I think you can. Mere words have killed a great many people in the name of genocide. The walls of democracy have not crumbled in those 18 countries because they have a law outlawing Holocaust denial. Why can't we have a law that outlaws denial of these other genocides that we're talking about? The question that resides in law to be determined is, which is the greater social harm? The harm to this doctrine of free speech, which, as I said, is not an absolute right at all, or the social, personal, psychic harm that denialism of a genocide produces. What is the Turkish problem? Why is there such an incredible level of denialism by the Republic of Turkey, where the whole apparatus of the state, and believe me, it is the whole apparatus of the state. We've already heard about Mr. Shoebridge's problem with emails. We've heard Mr. Atkinson's problem with a senator and a whole parliamentary hot topic, etc. This level of Turkish paranoia is the only word for it. The levels to which the Turkish government will go is almost unbelievable. We could stand here all night and regale you with stories of how the Turkish government, quite contrary to the laws of diplomacy, have seriously and systematically engaged in interference in Australia's domestic affairs. Panayotis Diamantis put on a conference at Macquarie in 1998 on the whole question of the fate of Christian minorities in the Near East. What happens is that a Turk invites himself to the conference. He wants to make a major denial speech, but the Turkish consul general arrives, eventually arrives with a band of thugs. They try to disrupt the meeting, and so it goes on and on and on. I don't have to go into all of this. Why the denial? There's several reasons. First of all, I think the young Turks who overthrew Sultan Hamid II in 1908 put forward the proposition to the world that they were establishing democracy, that the young Turkish movement would be beacons of democracy in that part of the Middle East or the Near East. If you set yourself up as a foundation stone of democracy in a region, a democracy can hardly turn around and say, we committed these atrocities, because democracies don't commit those atrocities. Not true, actually, because one of the subjects that needs serious study, and it has become a subject of study recently, is how much genocide has occurred in democratic states and by democratic states, including the United States and including this state. The Turks also have an ethos, a history, a belief system of honour, that there will be no blood on the national escutcheon, on the national shield, and therefore any suggestion that they have a blot on their history has to be eliminated. Thirdly, I think there is a very real fear of reparations, and reparations of the kind I've already suggested, or Thierry has suggested, of restoring, giving back, or paying financial compensation. There have been one or two cases recently, particularly New York Life Assurance Company with a private settlement and so on and so forth, with a group of survivors who claimed their rightful inheritances and payments and so on and so forth, but that's not the same as an official state of reparations. It's also interesting, just by the way, and in passing, that on National Sorry Day here in Australia, on February the 13th, 2008, when that very dramatic television presentation of a national apology occurred, there was a little rider attached to it at the end of the apology: there will be no reparations. Now, what kind of an apology is it when you apologize to the victims for what you've done, but say you're not worthy enough as victims to be given any compensation or reparations? And the ironic thing is that two of the worst offending states in Australian history, in terms of physical killing of Aborigines, Western Australia, set up a 2-year reparation scheme, but if you didn't apply within the 2 years, you couldn't apply anymore. But the one state, would you believe, that has paid reparations to Aborigines is Tasmania, where some families got, or some individuals got $55,000 each. A lot of them got $4,000 each, but okay, it's a very small price to pay for those activities. The fourth reason I want to give about Turkish denialism is that it's a state in transition. Turkey doesn't know at this stage whether it's going to be a secular state or remain a secular state, or whether it's going to become a fully Islamicized state with Sharia law and so on. When a state is in transition, it cannot afford to engage in activities like thinking about the past or making restitution or atonement for the past. And fifthly, and this is a little bit disconcerting, I think that the Turkish denial apparatus is so vast, so embedded, so imbued in their bureaucracies, in their state departments, in their schools, in their hospitals, in their clinics, wherever you may go, that it's a juggernaut that it couldn't stop even if it wanted to. And that is a very frightening prospect. It's only a thought, it's only a supposition on my part, but if tomorrow the Turkish government said, we stop with the denial, the machinery that they have set in motion has a momentum of its own, and it will continue. And finally, I come to the question of what we as an audience, we as a community, we as a group of victims in a sense, what can we do? You can firstly engage in lobbying parliamentarians, lobbying the press, lobbying councillors, lobbying anybody who will listen to your case, and eventually somebody will listen. You need to engage in another democratic process called pressure group politics, voting. A lot of politicians, with due respect to those who are in the room, believe that there are such things as the Jewish vote, the Greek vote, the Armenian vote. It's a myth. They may be important in 1 or 2 boroughs or 1 or 2 districts of a particular electorate, but they're not going to sway the whole national parliament or the whole state parliament. But politicians believe that they have to pay court to the views and the needs and the wants and the desires and the grievances of minority communities. Well, work on it, bank on it, do it. You can target the social media. You can target the events, not of Anzac Day, that would be seen rightly as some form of desecration of a day that is celebrated so greatly in Australia. But you can, as I suggested in my Richter scale, bring to the attention of the Australian public the events that not only led up to Anzac Day, but what it was, as Pagnotti has done so elegantly with Vic and Bob Kenyon, shown just how much Australian prisoners of war knew and saw of the events that we're talking about tonight. Leaving records, leaving memoirs, writing letters, sending postcards, taking pictures, writing memoirs and personal accounts of what went on in front of their very eyes, because the Australian prisoners of war were not put in jails or in dungeons. They were left in villages from which there was no way to get in or way to get out, so they were left running around in these little villages, and they happened to have cameras and they happened to have pen and pencil. There is the obvious route of education, and education in its very broadest sense. You can also engage in what I call the demolition, on various speakers this evening talked about the demolition of myths. How do you demolish a myth? Especially a myth that is as grand as the Anzac tradition, that the nation was born in the crucible of Gallipoli, that all the years that happened from 1788 to 1917 didn't occur, but suddenly we get born, a sort of special virgin birth that occurs in 1917 when we suddenly become a nation. I don't know what the hell we were supposed to be before 1917, but the notion is that 1917 we were born. It's a myth. Can you demolish myths? Well, it's interesting. I'm reading a book by Anthony Summers, who's a noted writer and journalist, on the life of J. Edgar Hoover. And there was a recent Clint Eastwood film, which I hear was not terribly good and I didn't want to see, but I'm interested in Hoover. The most powerful man in American history in the 20th century, the most powerful man for 50 years in America, turns out to be the worst public servant America has ever had. A crook, a liar, a cheat, a forger, a manipulator, a crucifier of innocent victims. In his alleged 200,000 communists in the United States over all those years of un-American activities, 4 were found guilty of anything. The myth of Hoover has been demolished in my lifetime. I grew up with all those comic books and the FBI and J. Edgar, and I wanted an Edgar Hoover shield and all the rest of it. We were all older, the older ones of us were brought up on that kind of nonsense. Myths can be demolished. You can also do what Varant Megadichian so acutely said at the Armenian commemoration last month, and that is talk to politicians. Varant, from memory, talked about at least 20 members of various parliaments who've come on board, who are making speeches, who are talking, who are supporting, who are arguing. Joe Hockey did it at the Willoughby Town Hall last month, pledging himself for as long as he breathed to try to bring the federal parliament to a recognition of these events. Politicians are the people who can make these resolutions, but we can help them and we can push them to make those resolutions. And finally, in conclusion, I want you to please take on board one message from me, that if you engage in lobbying, if you engage in social and political pressure, if you engage in disturbing Anzac traditions and memories and myths, don't for one single moment fall for the nonsense that by doing so, somehow you are un-Australian. Thank you.
Hello. We've all heard about the Armenian Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. Why is it that not many people have heard of the Pontian massacres and the Holocaust that occurred there, of all the Greeks? We've seen a lot of the Jewish Holocaust in movies. We've seen the Armenian sort of massacres debated in the French Parliament. We haven't heard anything about the Greek Holocaust that occurred in Pontos. Is it the denial?
I really don't know the answer. I wish I could answer your question because it's a good question. I think it's to do with diaspora. I think it's to do with fragmentation. I think it's very much to do with some of the things that occurred during the resettlement and the exchange of populations. I think that the events of the Second World War, especially involving Greece, occupied by the Nazis and so on, there's almost no breathing time between 1923 and 1940. You'll agree, it's only 17 years. So that you need to have a number of other priorities settled before you can begin addressing these historical questions. I also have to tell you that if we just go back to Holocaust history, which I know best, the events ended at the end of May, even beyond the defeat and surrender of Germany, where euthanasia programs still went on for another 3 weeks after the war had ended and so on. It took Jewish historians nearly 20 years to begin writing about those events. Non-Jewish writers addressed the issue. The Jewish writers were so shattered that Elie Wiesel, a famous survivor, always said, in the face of the Shoah, the Holocaust, there can only be silence. Yes, for a while. And I think that what probably happened, and I'm guessing that what happened to the people of Pontos is that it was such a shattering event that it took a while to get their breath back and to find the resources, the time, the energy to go back to an historical event. I suspect that's part of the issue. And in fact, when you look around now at other genocides, and I've been looking fairly carefully at some of them, most of the writing about Rwanda, which was 1994, only now, literally in 2012, are we beginning to see books and articles being written by Rwandans. The rest have been written by, in a sense, armchair Americans, armchair Australians, me, other people who looked at those events because we didn't have that personal involvement. We didn't have that personal catastrophe. So that's the only explanation. I know it's not a terribly good one, but 2012, the first public commemoration of the Pontian Greek destruction. Here we are, we go forward from here. Anything else? Okay, well, I will hand you over to our hostess.
That's mine.
Is that yours?
Yes. I would now like to call upon Mr. Dimitrios Kouklidis and Mrs. Helen Makris of Pontoxeniteas.
Thank you. I am greatly honoured the United Pontian Benevolent Brotherhood of New South Wales Limited Pontoxeniteas presented to Professor Colin Tatz on the occasion of the inaugural commemoration of the Pontian Genocide, 9th of May 2012. Thank you.
Reverend Father, Professor Tatz, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a truly remarkable evening. For the first time, we gathered in the People's House, the Parliament of New South Wales, to remember the victims of the Greek genocide, our ancestors. Our aim is to remember those we lost and to celebrate the survival of those who made it to the refugee camps of Greece, Syria, Armenia, and Russia. The Young Turks' plan to destroy the Greeks of Pontos and all Anatolia failed because our grandparents and great-grandparents fought and survived. Here in Australia, we have tried to rebuild something of the Pontos they lost, as much as this is possible. The music, the dances, the theatre, The language of our ancestors continues to be heard. It is now the duty of our children and our grandchildren to continue these into the 21st century. On behalf of the Bondoksenitheas Brotherhood, I thank Professor Tatz for his years of support and his wonderful address this evening. May you continue your important work for many years to come. Thank you also to our parliamentary representatives. We understand your time is limited and are honoured you joined us here for this important event. Thank you especially to everyone who attended this evening's historic event. Believe me, it will not be the last time we remember the Greek genocide in the Parliament House. On Anzac Day, we say, lest we forget. Tonight we add, Eonia tus η μνήμη. May their memory be eternal.
Χρόνια πολλά, Χριστός Ανέστη. Ευλογησιμότατε πατέρα Τσουλουκίδη, κύριε Γενικέ Πρόξενη της Ελλάδος, Βασίλειο Τόλο. Αξιότιμα μέλη του Κοινοβουλίου, φίλοι Αρμένοι και Ασσύριοι, κυρίες και κύριοι, η σημερινή μέρα είναι πολύ σημαντική για όλους μας και ειδικά για εκείνους που η καταγωγή τους προέρχεται από ανθρώπους που ήρθαν από τον Πόντο και την Ανατολία. Μεγαλώσαμε με θλιβερές ιστορίες των παππούδων και των γονιών μας, για αυτό που υπέστησαν την περίοδο της γενοκτονίας. Θεωρούμε ότι έφτασε η στιγμή και για σας να γίνετε γνώστες όλων των κακουχιών που υπέστησαν οι Έλληνες, Αρμένοι και Ασσύριοι κατά τη διάρκεια της γενοκτονίας. Οι μνήμες αυτές ποτέ δεν έσβησαν και ούτε θα σβήσουν έως ότου το επίσημο τουρκικό κράτος απολογηθεί για τις πράξεις του κατά τη διάρκεια της Οθωμανικής κυβέρνησης εκείνης της εποχής. Για την πρόσκληση προκειμένου να τιμήσουμε την ημέρα μνήμης, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω την κυρία Σόφη Κότσι, καθώς όλα και τα μέλη του Κοινοβουλίου, τα οποία στηρίζουν την ιδέα του αγώνα μας για την αναγνώριση της γενοκτονίας τόσο των Ελλήνων όσο των Ασσυρίων και Αρμενίων. Τελειώνοντας, είναι καθήκον μας να επιβάλλουμε στα παιδιά μας να συνεχίσουν τον αγώνα μέχρι τη δικαίωση. Ευχαριστώ για την παρουσία σας.
Thank you very much for being so patient. It's been a long evening, I know. We're finished for this evening. We may adjourn outside to the lobby for drinks and refreshments. Thank you.